If we want to solve equations, we really need to have a good understanding of what an operation is and what we mean by its inverse. First of all, let's have a look at operations. So operations are the things that you can do to the numbers or the variables that you have. The most simple example I can think of, and the most basic, probably the first thing you met, was addition. After addition, I think actually a lot of people quite like multiplication. And then I'll put down subtraction and division. There are other operations than these. These are perhaps the four most basic ones, but they'll be enough to give the idea. So operations are basically just things that you can do that have an effect on either your variable or other number in your mathematics. So now I'm going to introduce this idea of an inverse. And it's quite simple really. An inverse is, if you like, the opposite. It's the thing that you would need to do to undo your operation. So if I were to add 5 and ask you how to undo that, hopefully you would all be saying to me that you would subtract 5, you would take away. So addition and subtraction are paired together, and at the moment I've got subtraction being the inverse of addition. And that means a fairly obvious pairing there. Division is the inverse of multiplication. But what I'm getting at as well is I could have done that differently. I could have swapped them around if I go back to doing that. Addition is the inverse of subtraction, and multiplication is the inverse of division. They're in pairs, and one of them is the inverse of the other. And whichever one happens first, then you do the other one of the pair to undo that action. Sometimes we want to undo multiple operations, so it's not impossible that two things or more than two things will be happening, but we'll stick with two for now. So I could be beginning with a variable x, deciding to multiply it by 3 and then subtract 2 and get the answer 13. So what would that mean if I tried to reverse that process? Well, let's have a go doing exactly that. What we would do is we would begin from the point of view of 13 and try and reverse it to learn what x was. And we've spoke about inverses, so we should have some knowledge. The inverse of taking away 2, so the opposite of taking away 2, if you like, would be to add 2. The inverse of multiplying by 3, hopefully you agree that it's dividing by 3. And if we look at the whole thing now, reversing the process, I'd go from 13, I'd add 2, divide by 3, and I would learn that x originally was the number 5. Few key things to point out though. When creating this process, I did the multiply by 3 and then the subtracting by 2. Reversing it, it was the issue with the 2 that was addressed first before dealing with the 3. So it's the inverse operations in the opposite order, and that's really, really important. I often find it helpful to think about putting your shoes and socks on. In the morning, when you're getting dressed, you'd have to put your socks on before your shoes. When you're trying to get undressed, you can't take your socks off first. So maybe that'll help.